Hello and welcome to Global Policy Forum's video series. This is an interview with Ambassador Anwarul Chowdhury. Ambassador Chowdhury was appointed as the UN's High Representative for Least Developed Countries in 2002. He led the negotiations for the least developed countries during the third UN Conference on Least Developed Countries, which adopted the Brussels Programme of Action. Prior to the fourth UN Conference on LDCs, Ambassador Chowdhury called upon countries to urgently address the most pressing issues faced by the poorest segments of the world's societies. However, the conference failed to deal with the most pressing issues. This interview was taken shortly after and covers the failure of the UN conferences, as well as the World Trade Organization's Doha round of trade agreements. Ambassador Chowdhury speaks to the lack of democracy in international economic institutions. He calls for reform and advocates for a move away from economic growth-orientated development to a more holistic approach, which considers well-being and human development. Ambassador Chowdhury, could you talk about the importance of South-South cooperation for LDCs?
I believe that the potential for South-South cooperation is there because of historical, colonial and geographic reasons. The industrialized countries have a major responsibility because these poorest countries, if we can trace back many of their histories, are poor today because of the exploitation of the past. Again, as many countries of the South, or a number of countries of the South, are emerging in a big way and increasing their share of the global economy, it is necessary that they should also come forward. During the Doha trade round, my efforts to promote regional cooperation, I had emphasized this dimension again and again. And I believe that a number of countries in Africa have formed regional and sub-regional collaborative arrangements for trade. As some areas they are attempting to make one common market for them. Same in South Asia or Southeast Asian nations. They are trying to take advantage of regional cooperation. But the trade barriers among these countries are still a big obstacle. And the landlocked countries, for their trade, need the support of cooperation of neighboring countries. Most of them are developing countries and some of them are even least developed countries. So among themselves they need to overcome the trade barriers. When I was working in the United Nations, there were more trade barriers among developing countries than between industrialized and least developed countries. So I advocated very strongly that these barriers should be taken down. European Union has a policy called EBA, everything but arms. So everything that is exported to the European Union from the least developed countries are duty-free, quota-free. They cannot include arms in that, which is good as a policy, but they have made some caveats and some exclusions, like some of the agricultural products are not allowed in. So that creates a big problem. But I would emphasize again that it is very necessary to create the productive capacity through development aid, technical assistance, training opportunities, and access to raw materials for producing these things is very important. Because sometimes when you go to procure raw materials for the things that you produce from your neighboring country, the trade barriers are so difficult or the prices go so high that your products are not competitive in either the regional market nor in the global market.
Ambassador Chowdhury, you've suggested that LDCs have been disappointed and frustrated by their development partners, particularly at the slowness of negotiations and the lack of creativity of recommendations. What are the possibilities for putting forth creative alternative recommendations for economic and social development in the least developed countries?
These developed countries, apart from their ongoing development challenges, also face setbacks because of certain unforeseen situations. This can be natural disaster, volatility of the global market in terms of commodity and energy prices, and food prices are now going up again. I would like to include the lack of credit for these countries. They cannot borrow, and the global economic problem in the industrialized countries have also affected them in a big way. In the cases of World Bank and IMF, the conditionalities are such strong that these countries really back their break repaying their loan. But another problem which has come in, and that is going to be a longer term challenge, is the climate change. Climate change is affecting many things in terms of economic and social development for the least developed countries. It is happening for all countries, but least developed countries are worst prepared to face these challenges. The Istanbul Program of Action, or for that matter, the Brussels Program of Action for the least developed countries, were not prepared to face this kind of situation. You have to do something which will address these challenges for the least developed countries. And I suggested in 2008 in an article for the creation of a global safety net for these countries, that there will be a net which will protect these countries facing such unforeseen circumstances. That's a major way of being creative in addressing the needs of the least developed countries.
At the 4th UN Conference on Least Developed Countries held this year in Istanbul, traditional development partners called for emerging powers to take more responsibility towards least developed countries and development aid. Could you talk about this in relation to India's role in the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, acronymed SAARC?
South Asia should not be seen only through the prism of India and Pakistan relations. I think this really convolutes the picture. And now Afghanistan has been added to SAARC, so we have 8 members now. As a region, it has the largest poverty-stricken people, and I believe we have every reason to work together to see that we benefit our common people. For any economically powerful country, it is a responsibility of those countries to see to it that their economic progress and development helps the poorest of the poor, either in the region or in the world as a whole. And this comment I make bearing in mind all the already established, rich, developed, industrialized countries, and also, of course, the emerging countries. These countries need to build into their development prospects an opportunity for at least the neighboring segment of poverty coming up along with them. Indian policymakers should see to it that region as a whole benefits from their economic progress. And as a rising economic power, India has a responsibility to make sure that their neighbors feel comfortable with their rise and their neighbors do not feel neglected out of the process.
The World Trade Organization, World Bank and IMF have very different approaches to globalization and understanding the way in which it has impacted LDCs as compared to the United Nations. Could you talk about the role that these international economic institutions have played in LDCs?
True.
These are really not very democratic organizations. So in terms of decision making, and that is very important because the structures of these organizations were set up in a Second World War context, but the world has changed. So we need to make these organizations more democratic, more participatory, more conscious of the needs of the poorest segment of humanity. These organizations should not be the organs which protect the interest of already powerful countries, economically or otherwise. For that, many attempts have been made, many conferences have taken place, but ended with only a call for increased democratization, but nothing much has happened. Only slight movement have been made in terms of the voting structure in the World Bank and IMF because of some of these emerging countries, but that is still far from the moment we can call them truly democratic.
In addition to lacking democratic agency, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund prioritize economic growth, often at the expense of human development and well-being, concepts that have been put forward by scholars such as Amartya Sen and that have been welcomed by the United Nations. Could you talk about the difference in approach between the United Nations and these other international economic institutions?
I think these organizations are still being run by the people who believe in economic growth as the key factor in economic development. I believe very strongly that human development is an essential element of global development. It is very necessary not to forget the human being the center of all our development efforts. Not only development efforts, of all human endeavor. So that is why I believe that if we forget the individual behind all our endeavor, then we are not getting there. And that is what has happened. All these years of efforts made by these global institutions have failed to really make a mark in terms of human happiness, human progress, human contentment,